Welcome to the BYU Family History webinar series. My name is Bela Gandhi and I will be your host for this webinar. Please, if you like, participate in our polls on the screen. Let us know where you're listening from and how you heard about the webinar. In way of announcements today, our next webinar is entitled Using Microtasks to Involve Everyone in Family History, and our presenter will be Joe Price. That webinar is scheduled for June 1st at 4 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. For those of you who are having trouble accessing our webinars on YouTube, we have a new platform that allows you to play our YouTube videos in church buildings. The link to the platform is on the main page of our website, which I have put in the announcement box below. And also, if you have visited that platform, but you haven't in a while, we did just recently update that platform with our Ancestry.com, BYU, HBLL resources, and DNA webinars from our YouTube page. So check it out. Let us know what you think of it, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu. So today we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation entitled English Civil Registration Made Easy. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn started doing family history and discovered a new passion. Her specialty is mentoring new family historians and helping them find success. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library. She also presents at Riverton Saturday seminars and other family history events. Her column on BYU family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. Kathryn works for the LDS Church as a technical writer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and homemade guacamole. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us and remind you as Kathryn gets things loaded up here about our comments and question box on the left-hand side of the screen. Any questions that you have, write them in and we'll make sure that they get answered by the end of the presentation. Also, just to make it easier for me and for Kathryn, please make sure to write the questions in the question box, which is the top box, and any of your insights, please feel free to comment in the bottom box. Kathryn, whenever you are ready, feel free.
I don't know how much everybody heard. So I thank you for joining us for our webinar today on English civil registration. And this used to be such a mystery to me. I remember first learning about it and completely not getting it, not understanding what it was about, what the purpose was, or even why it was useful. So if you have felt that same way, then I hope that this webinar will be helpful to you today in kind of making some of the mystery of it a little more clear and explaining why this is such a great genealogical resource. So let's go ahead and look at what we're going to be covering today in our webinar. If I can get the slide to advance. There we go. Okay, so first of all, what exactly is civil registration? And then next, how does civil registration work in England? Because many countries do have civil registration, but it works slightly differently in every country. Then finally, or excuse me, not finally, but what information is included on civil registration records? Where and how can you search for civil registration? And then finally, how can you order the original certificates if you need to? So let's go ahead and dive in. First of all, what is civil registration? Very simply, it's the reporting of vital events to a government authority, and usually those events will be births, marriages, and deaths. Sometimes divorces might be included, adoptions, and so forth, but for the purposes of our webinar today, we'll just be talking about births, marriages, and deaths. So how does civil registration work in England? What's particular about the system in that country? So here are some highlights. First of all, civil registration began in England on the 1st of July, 1837. And I think it's not a coincidence, actually, that 1837 was also the first year that LDS missionaries arrived in England. I just think that's really cool. All citizens were required to register. Now, the reason this is significant is before this time, the main records in England, the best source of births, marriages, and deaths were records kept by churches, so parish registers. But not everybody attended a church, and not everybody attended the state church or the Church of England, the established church as they called it. And so you had some people that were missed from the parish registers. But with and that became more true as time went on. In, the 15, 16, 1700s, when it was the clergymen were required by law to record vital events, and most people went to the state church, well, then in that case, most people were listed in the parish registers. But as time went on and religion fell out of favor and nonconformist churches started springing up, some of the nonconformist churches kept better records than others. So as church records were still really good before civil registration, but they were getting less and less inclusive as time went on. So civil registration started to be like a complete list of all the citizens, so regardless of their religious affiliation. Now, the thing about that, of course, is too that not everybody complies with government regulations, and so especially when it was starting, not everybody, it took the citizens a little while to get in the groove and get into the habit of reporting things to the government. But as time went on, the registration rates got higher and higher, and it's believed that now they're pretty close to 100%. There's always going to be people who don't register for whatever reason, but it's a pretty complete record of births, marriages, and deaths in the United Kingdom. Or in England, excuse me, let's be clear about that. Registration in England is done by what is called a registration district. These are not necessarily synonymous with sorry, I'm still a little bit phased by the trouble that we had at the beginning. I'm having a little difficulty here. So the registration districts are not necessarily synonymous with geographic districts, and we'll be talking more about that in a little bit. So the results are indexed by quarter, and that's also a unique thing that we have to understand in order to find the records that we're looking for, and we'll talk a little bit more about how the quarters work too. So let's take a look at the registration process. This is a very high-level process, and I also wanted to mention that as I was doing the research for this webinar, I found that there was some contradiction in the way that people said that the registration process worked, and so I don't know if some of the information was out of date. As far as I could tell, though, this appears to be the most accurate high-level process. So the first thing that happens is, of course, there's a birth, marriage, or death, and then that event is reported to a local registrar who is responsible for receiving registrations of those events, and they create a certificate. Each quarter, the local registrar sends copies of the certificates to the superintendent registrar. So we've got a couple of levels of registrars in this system, which is understandable because it would be absolutely overwhelming for one person or even a small group of people to do. So we've got a local registrar, we've got a superintendent registrar, and then the superintendent registrar forwards the certificates to the registrar general, or in other words, the person who's at the national level. And then finally, the registrar general keeps the copies of the certificates that are sent to him or her, and then produces alphabetic quarterly indexes, because the registrations are compiled or filed in the order in which they were received. So in other words, it's completely random. It just depends on when somebody was born, when they died, when the event was reported. And so in order to be able to find any kind of registration after the fact, an index is absolutely essential. Now, the indexes can be searched for free, but certificates must be purchased. So let's talk a little bit about how the quarters work. And again, these are quarters that indicate when the event was reported. So the quarters are named by the last quarter or last month of the quarter. So the March quarter covers January through March. The June quarter covers April through June. The September quarter covers July through September. And finally, the December quarter covers October through December. And that can be a little confusing sometimes when people see March quarter. They assume that maybe the quarter starts with March. But for whatever reason, the GRO, the General Register Office, or the body that is responsible for registration in England, they decided to name the quarters by the last month of the quarter. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the quarter is when the event was registered and not necessarily when it occurred. So registration deadlines were established by statute in England, and they are as follows. Birth events had to be registered within 42 days of the birth, or 6 weeks. A marriage had to be registered at the time of the marriage. And finally, a death had to be registered within 5 days, unless there was some kind of an inquest into the death. But under normal circumstances, they were responsible for reporting the death to the government within 5 days of when it happened. So you can see that the quarter is not always going to be an accurate reflection of the actual event as shown in this example. So suppose that a birth took place on the 15th of December in 1845, but the parents weren't able to register the birth until the 5th of January 1846. Well, January falls in the March quarter, so the quarter for that birth would be March quarter 1846, but that isn't the same as the birth date of December 1845. So that's just something to keep in mind with civil registration, is that it's usually not going to be exact for the month and the year of the birth. It'll a lot of times be close for the month, but it may be a year off, and it will and the name of the quarter can also throw things off a little bit. So that's just something to keep in mind. So what about registration districts? They tend to be a little bit confusing because we don't really, for those of you who are listening from the United States, we don't really have something similar here. So I'll try to explain as best I can how those registration districts work. So first of all, as I mentioned before, they're not, strictly speaking, geographic districts. Rather, they're administrative districts. Kind of the closest analogy, if you will, in the United States would be a voting district. So a voting district, you never say, I was born in the such and such voting district. It's purely administrative. And registration districts in England are the same in that sense. They are just administrative by the government, but they don't necessarily correspond to geographic locations. Or geographic divisions would be a better way to say that. Interestingly enough, they were actually based on the boundaries of poor law unions, if you're familiar with those. And if you're not, like I wasn't, I had to look that up and come to discover that around, I believe it was the 1600s, that up until a certain point, parishes in England were responsible to care for the poor within the boundaries of their parish. But at a later time, they changed that and made groups of parishes and towns and so forth responsible for caring for the poor. So they established these boundaries for areas and called them poor law unions. And anybody that needed help in that area was helped by that poor law union. Well, for whatever reason, I don't know why exactly, when they established registration districts, they initially based them on poor law unions. Well, the poor law unions didn't follow, like I mentioned, geographic boundaries. So a registration district can cover one county, it can cover part of a county, or it can even cover multiple counties. There just seems to be really no rhyme or reason as to how the boundaries were established. I suspect there was, but I was not able to find any information about how they made those decisions about the boundaries. And not only that, the boundaries changed over time. So it's important to point out that just as a quarter is not the same thing as an exact birth date, a registration district is also not the same as an exact birthplace. It may have the same name as a parish, city, or county, or all three. So a good example of that is Lincoln. There is a Lincoln registration district, but there's also a Lincoln parish, a Lincoln city, and a Lincoln county. So you can see that if you used a registration district as a birthplace, that could get ambiguous. People might not necessarily know which you were referring to. And not only that, in the case where a registration district covers several counties, then people may infer the wrong county. And an example of that is Gainsborough. The Gainsborough registration district covers parts of Lincolnshire and parts of Nottinghamshire. And so if you just put Gainsborough, then it's not possible for someone to tell just from that which county the person was born in. So for that reason, I know some people do go ahead and use the registration district as a birthplace, for instance, in Family Tree, but I've just found because of the potential confusion, it's probably better not to do that. And with the records that we have today, it's generally so easy to find out a person's real birthplace that there's no reason really not to do that and just put in the accurate information rather than putting in a general area such as a registration district. So that was a kind of a high-level view of how civil registration works in England. If you'd like to dive a little deeper, here are some resources. The Family Search Wiki has a great article on English civil registration. And just as an FYI, these links will not be clickable in the YouTube video, in the recording, but if you go to the slide deck, these links are clickable and will take you straight to the page. And at the end of the webinar, I'll show a URL where you can have access to the slide deck. So the Family Search Wiki, it has a great article. A site called byu.edu, or sorry, I should have said the second one. On BYU EDU is a site called dea.byu.edu, and that is devoted to English research. It's a great resource for many things, including civil registration. So you can check out the civil registration article there. And then finally, I found this Manchester and Lancashire Family History Society page on civil registration, and honestly, it was one of the best ones that I had found. That may be because it's created by people from England, and so it's, they have firsthand knowledge, of course, of the way the system works and so forth. And so I found this very helpful, and another great resource to learn about civil registration in England. So what key information do certificates of civil registration provide? Let's take a look at each one of them: birth, marriage, and death. So first of all, a birth certificate. We've got the date and the place of the birth will be shown, the exact date. We've got the first and any middle names of the child. We've got the gender or the sex of the child. Now in this place, normally there would be the name of the father, but if the father is either not known or not acknowledged, then this place will be blank. And so that indicates that in this case, Gertrude Louisa was born out of wedlock. In the next square, we've got Emma Espen as the mother, so it lists the mother. What I love about this is that it lists the mother's maiden name. So we know how difficult it can be sometimes to find the maiden name of a mother, so an English birth registration is a great way to get that information. The occupation of the father is listed in this cell if the father is known. And then here we've got the informant, so who reported the birth. Interestingly enough, it was the master at the poorhouse or the union workhouse where Emma was staying when she had the baby. So that's an interesting bit of information about her circumstances. And while it may not necessarily be genealogically pertinent from the standpoint that it's not a date or a place, it still gives us an insight into her life. If you want to learn more about poorhouses or workhouses, try Googling it, and there is a site that explains all about them. In many instances, they were not pleasant places. In fact, if you remember Oliver Twist, where Oliver ended up was a workhouse or a poorhouse. So they were often very unpleasant. There was a lot of illness. There was a lot of mistreatment of people. So knowing that she lived in a workhouse gives me more of a sense of what her life was like and gives me more empathy for her and what she was going through. So these last two columns just show when the birth was registered and who it was registered by. So that's a birth registration. Let's take a look at a marriage registration. So first of all, at the top, it's going to tell you where the marriage was solemnized. And you remember just a few minutes ago, I talked about how not all ceremonies were performed at churches. This is one example. So Gertrude, when she got older and got married, this is the same gal that was on the birth registration we just looked at. When she got married, they chose to get married in the government office and not in a church. And this became more and more the case as time moved on and as religion, unfortunately, became less a part of people's lives in not just England, but in all countries, it looks like. So in addition to the marriage place, we'll have the marriage date. We'll have the names of the bride and groom and their ages. If you ever see full age in this column or cell, then that means that they had attained the age of majority, or in other words, of legal age, where they could marry without a parent's consent. And that age changed a little bit over time. And so if you want to know the exact age of majority for the date of a marriage, then I would suggest probably Googling that to find out. But in this case, they did give what appeared to be exact ages for the bride and groom. And then also, they would tell the status of the person, the marital status. A bachelor just meant that he had not been married before, and spinster meant that she had not been married before. If it showed widow or widower, then that indicated they were married before, and that can be genealogically helpful if you know that you need to look for a previous spouse. In the next column, the rank or profession of the bride and groom are listed, and then their residence at the time of marriage. So this can be very helpful if you're trying to match somebody up, maybe with a census record. So for instance, the name Robinson, William Robinson here, is not exactly an uncommon name. And so if I wanted to be sure that I'd found him in a census before or after the marriage, it could be that he would be living in the same place. If he didn't, that wouldn't prove that he wasn't the same person. But if it was the same, that would be really strong evidence that I had found the right person in the census. So that address can be helpful in finding other records for your people. Next, the father's rank the father's name is given, and then finally his rank or profession. And notice again on the birth record, Gertrude's father was not known. So here her father is not listed, and also his occupation is not listed. One thing I love, too, about these marriage certificates is that the person, since marriages were required to be registered at the time of marriage, it gave an opportunity for the bride and groom to sign. So you may be able to see the autograph of your person, which is kind of cool. But if we look at this one, notice that William apparently was not able to read or write, and so the registrar had him mark an X. And then the registrar or somebody wrote the mark of William Robinson. And it was the same with Edward Besceby, who was actually Gertrude's foster father or stepfather, however we would want to call that. But he was the man who married Emma when she got married and then helped raise Gertrude and the children that they had together. So these witnesses can also provide some good hints about other family members. As I recall, Edith turned out to be a sister-in-law. I believe she married one of Gertrude's brothers. Don't quote me on that, but I seem to recall that she was related to the family in some way. So even though the relationships aren't given on the witnesses, often they are family members and they can give you clues to help find additional family. Let's look at a death certificate. So as you would expect, the place and date of the death are listed, the name of the person who died, the sex or gender of the person, and then also the age. So this family lost their little boy at 13 days old. If he had died as an adult, his occupation would be listed here. But for children who died as infants, often the parents would be listed. So that could be another very valuable piece of information on a death registration. The cause of death is also given, and again, while that's not necessarily, it's not a date or a place, but it is related to our hearts, right? We can look at that and we can just know a little bit more about that family and empathize with what they went through. So I feel like it is valuable from that standpoint. And then finally, we've got the informant who reported the death. That also could end up being a family member, and that could be genealogically valuable information. And then in the last two columns, again, we've got the date when it was registered and the person who registered. Okay, let's talk about where we can find civil registration information. The main repositories, there are a number of them online, but I'm just going to mention probably the 5 most common. The first is the General Register Office, or the GRO. The next is a wonderful site called FreeBMD, the BMD stands for Births, Marriages, and Deaths. The next one is good old Family Search Historical Records. Then we could turn to Ancestry and also Find My Past, which specializes in English record. Only the GRO holds certificates, and that's an important thing to keep in mind if you want to buy a certificate. The other repositories only make indexes available. That being said, some of the other sites will allow you to order certificates through them, but they go back to the GRO, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. So if you're like me, I learn best or remember best by actually going through some steps in context. So I want to walk us through a search in these various sites for somebody on my family lines. Her name is Emma Besceby, and so we're going to be looking for her birth registration. From family records and from multiple census records, I know that she was born about 1845 in a little parish called Everton, Lincolnshire. And I also do know that her mother's maiden name is Priestley. So let's take a look at how we could search. The first thing that you want to do most of the time is probably to find the registration district, which, as we mentioned before, is not the same as the parish. It might have the same name, but most of the time actually it won't. And so what I'll usually do, the easiest way to find it is just for me to Google. So I will just ask Google registration district for Everton, Lincolnshire, and normally the registration district comes up within the first or second hit. So in this case, I've really got two choices. I've got the Sleaford district or the Lincolnshire district. I'm going to try the top one first because I think that's probably going to be the right one. But if it turns out not to be, at least I've got one more that I can check. So I click on that and it gives me a list of all the parishes, or places rather, in list of places in the Sleaford Registration District. And as I page down, lo and behold, there's Evedon. And it also gives me the dates when it was part of this registration district, because as we pointed out before, the boundaries would change. So my Emma was born about 1845, and that fortunately is covered in this date range from 1837 to 1889. So I'm now very confident that the Sleaford Registration District is the registration district that contains the Evedon Parish, and so that is where I'm most likely going to find Emma's birth registration. So let's take a look really quickly at how I would find this registration in the GRO index. And I wanted to comment here, my point here is not to give really detailed step-by-step instructions, but rather to just give you an overview of how you would search on the different sites, and then also how the records look different on the different sites, even though they're all pointing back to the same civil registration. So here we've gone to the General Register office, and there's the URL up at the top of the screen. And I click on the various options that lead me to search, and this is the kind of form that I get. So I have chosen to search for birth, and I input the names. Be careful here because the surname is first. I've tried to search backwards before and nothing was found. It's funny how literal computers are, right? So do be sure that you put the right name in the right slot. And then I specified the gender, the year the birth was probably registered, and I gave it a plus or minus 1. This only goes up to 2 actually, so I could have gone plus or minus 2, but I thought 1 was probably good enough here. If I hadn't gotten results, I would have extended it. And then here I put in the Sleaford Registration District and I click Search, which is actually at the bottom of the screen. We can't see that right now. And lo and behold, up comes the birth registration. We've got Emma, and we've got her in actually 1845. One thing to point out here is that on the GRO search results, they will just put the first letter of the name of the quarter. And remember that the name of the quarter is the last month of the quarter. So this J is actually for the June quarter. Sometimes you might look at that and go, oh, January. But it's actually the June quarter. The quarter that contains January is called the March quarter, so it would have an M here instead of a J. And we've got the registration district that we asked for, and then we've got the volume and the page number, and this information is very helpful if you want to order a certificate. It will enable the people that are trying to find the certificate to find it more accurately. So this is great information. So that's what searching looks like on the GRO site. And here are just some, I don't know, what would you call it, idiosyncrasies, or just kind of the way this site works that is different than the way some of the other sites work that we're going to look at in a minute or two. So this index only covers births and deaths. You actually cannot currently, and that's as the date of this webinar, which is May 2018, you cannot currently search for marriages in the GRO index. You can order the certificates, but you got to find the information someplace else. You can only search for one event at a time. In other words, a birth or a death. You can't say, give me the birth and the death for a certain person. The date range is 5 years max at a time. That can make things a little tedious for searching, especially if you're trying to maybe, say, find all the siblings in a family. But I suspect they did it so that their servers wouldn't get overwhelmed, because if people were doing, searches that covered many decades, that could really be a hit against their servers. So you can only search 5 years at a time, and the way you do that is by entering that date as we looked at. Let me just back up here. You would enter a date, and then you would choose plus or minus 2 years, and that would give you the date plus the date you entered plus 2 years on either side for a total of 5 years. The search site does not allow wildcards, and so that can make searching a little more challenging. Sometimes what I will do is go to a site that does allow wildcards, find the record, and then come back to the GRO and search for it again. For instance, if let me give you a use case for that. No other site lists the mother's maiden name before 1912, as I recall. That's actually on a later slide. We'll check that out later. But before that time, all the other sites except the GRO do not list the mother's maiden name, but the GRO does. So if I want the mother's maiden name, but I can't find a pre-1912 record, then I would, in the GRO, then I'd go out and find it on another site, then come back to the GRO with what I've learned from the other site, maybe a misspelling or something along those lines, and then I can more easily find it in the GRO, and then I can find the mother's maiden name. So the GRO, while it doesn't allow wildcards, it does allow fuzzy name searching. And by that I mean variants on the name. So they've actually got two options. They've got phonetically similar and another one that I don't recall off the top of my head. But they use two different algorithms. And so you can do broader searches than just exact. The exact is the default. And if you don't want to search by exact, in fact, let me back up here and show you that. So it's right here. So exact matches only, that's the default. But if you want to do a phonetic type of search, you click the down arrow and it will give you two choices for different algorithms for searching. The spouse's mother's maiden name is given for all births, which is wonderful because that's not the case on any other site that I'm aware of. The spouse's name is not applicable in this case because the index doesn't allow us to search marriages. The sex is given, and that, as I recall, is the GRO is the only site that gives the sex or the gender for the person. Death records will give the age at death for all records, and that is also unique to the GRO site. Finally, their search on jurisdictions is unusual from other sites too. You can search for one district or nothing, and you cannot search by county. So that's one reason, if you're using the GRO site, why it's very helpful to find the registration district, especially if you've got a really common name like William Robinson and you need to narrow down the results. Okay, that is GRO. Let's take a look at FreeBMD. This is probably my go-to site for civil registration because its search is really powerful, and I'll show you why that is. So here's the search form, and here again we're searching for Emma Besceby. And I need to point out something here where I found out actually that searching by Besceby does not bring her up in this record, so rather, or on FreeBMD because of a misspelling, as we'll see. So I skipped the dead end and just put the wildcard in. So here we've got an asterisk as a wildcard, and that means I want anything that starts with BES, has whatever in the middle, and ends with BY. The asterisk can actually stand for 0 to infinity number of characters. If I had just wanted one character, I would have put a question mark. So if I knew that there was just one character that was wrong, then that's when I'd use that. So I use the wildcard search, put her first name. I didn't put in the rest of this information because the spouse and the mother's surname would not be on this, well, spouse wouldn't be on a birth record for one thing, the spouse of Emma, but then also the mother's surname would not be on a record that was between 1844 and 1846. And also, of course, Emma's spouse will not be on her birth record, and her death would not be listed on her birth record, so I did not fill in that information. If I had wanted to do a phonetic search, I could have clicked this box here, but I chose to do the wildcard instead because, as it turns out, the misspelling makes this not very phonetically searchable. The thing that I love here, in addition to the date range, that makes it really easy. You can specify just any date range. And this first item right here is the quarter. So I'm searching from the beginning quarter of 44 to the ending quarter of 46. But this I have not seen on any other site. FreeBMD lets you search either by registration district or by county. So if you choose a county, they have programmed it on the back end so that it will search any piece of a registration district that falls in those county boundaries. So that is really helpful for counties like Lincolnshire that have multiple registration districts in them. So here is the sample result that I got. And you can see that Emma's last name has been misspelled as Besrobi. So that is why she didn't come up when I searched with the name Bescoby. And here are the idiosyncrasies, if you will, or the tips for using FreeBMD. The index coverage is all three events, births, marriages, and deaths. You can search for multiple events at a time. The date range is any that you want to specify as long as it's covered by the records. So that would be starting in July of 1837 and going on until the records stop. The wildcards of a question mark and an asterisk are acceptable. And one comment about that, our purpose today isn't to go on a deep dive about wildcards, but if you'd like to learn more, go to the BYU FHL webinar page, and we have a webinar about wildcards. The fuzzy name search, the site offers, as we saw, a phonetic option on the surname. Here's a thing that is different about this site than any other site that I'm aware of, and that is that starts with is the default on the first names. So how would you use that? Well, suppose that you had an ancestor named Elizabeth, and you weren't sure if her name was spelled E-L-I-S, E-L-I-Z, or whatever. Well, if you just enter E-L-I, then it will find any name that starts with E-L-I. So it'll find Eliza, Elizabeth with an S, Elizabeth with a Z, and that's the default. If you don't want that, then there is a checkbox for you to search with an exact first name. The mother's birth surname is given for births starting in the September quarter of 1911. That's what I was looking for. So September quarter of 1911 and forward, FreeBMD will give you the mother's birth surname, but not before that time. The spouse's name is given starting in March quarter of 1912. The sex is not given on these records, although very often it can be inferred from the name, not always though. The age at death is given for records starting in the March quarter of 1866, which also differs from the GRO because it gives the age at death for all of its death registrations. And as we pointed out, the jurisdictions you can search are either district or county, and that can be very helpful. Okay, that's FreeBMD. Let's take a look. Oh, I forgot. I wanted to mention one thing about the marriages. So we mentioned that, let me get back here, that the spouse's name is only given after March quarter of 1912. Before that time, when you search for marriage in FreeBMD or any other site that provides searches for marriages, you just get a list of everybody on that registration page. So at the first, they would put like 8 couples on a page, and so you may, in the late 1830s and 1840s, you will get a list of 8 possible people that were on a marriage page, and you have to figure out which spouses go with which. Later on, they cut it down to 2 couples, and so you just have to figure out, for my Mary Stokes Bescovy, did she marry William Portis or Hastings Smith? So at least I've narrowed that down to 2 names, but this screen does not tell me which of those 2 men she married. Instead, I have to either order the certificate or find an original marriage record or parish register on film, whatever it might be. But you can't tell from looking at this who the person married. But after, or starting in 1912, the spouse is, oops, sorry about that, I advanced it too fast. Starting in 1912, the spouse is listed next to the name. So here we see on this marriage in 1913 that Charles Arden married Bescovy, and Bescovy married Arden. Hardy married Leake, Leake married Hardy. So that takes the mystery out of it. You just know right away who the person was that they married. Family Search historical records. Let's look quickly at performing, again, the same search leading to the same information, but the important thing here is how it looks different, because again, it's not always obvious that you're looking at civil registration or the same thing that you would get from the GRO. So I've input the same information. You're probably getting familiar with that by now. And I've narrowed it down by choosing births, baptisms, and christenings at the bottom. Otherwise, if I didn't, I'd get all kinds of everything. I'd get a lot of census records, marriage, death, and so forth. And I just wanted to narrow it to births. And as it turns out, she's right at the top here. And you can see that that's probably the same record because it's 1845 and it's in Sleaford. But to be sure, let's click on it. And when we do, it pops down this extra information. Now, what I really like here that Family Search has done is they've listed all 3 months in the quarter, and that's very helpful to avoid confusion. So even though the GRO would call this the June quarter, Family Search does list all 3 months in the quarter. So we know that this birth was registered sometime in those 3 months. Could have happened before, the birth itself could have happened before April, but we know that the registration took place sometime in those 3 months. And we've got the volume down here and the page number. Okay, so Family Search search tips. A little bit different. The GRO and FreeBMD were the most unique in the way that they allow searches. Family Search and other comparable sites like Ancestry and Find Myself are very, very similar. So Family Search will allow you to search for births, marriages, and deaths. You can search for multiple events at a time, specify any age range or any date range, Wildcards are the same, the question mark that represents exactly 1 character and the asterisk that represents 0 to any number. The fuzzy search is on by default on Family Search historical records. If you don't want it, you click the exact checkboxes. And this, in my experience, is one of maybe the best kept secrets on Family Search because it's not really obvious what those checkboxes are for. Let's go back and take a look. So on the search, you notice there's checkboxes next to some of the fields. Well, if you check that, it will only bring up the name of Emma or only the name of Bescovy. No Bescovy with a K, no Bescovy with a B-I-S, no Emma with, 1 M or whatever. Click that checkbox and it will only return results that exactly match whatever you've put in these boxes. So back to our screen we were on. And then the same thing here. All the rest of this is the same as it was for FreeBMD, with the exception of the jurisdiction search. And Family Search will let you search for whatever. You can search for counties, registration districts, parishes, just anything that you want to put in your search field there. Okay, Ancestry.com, again, very similar. I'm going to search for the wildcard here. I have just put in the same information. I've limited it to England here. And this is the result that I get. It's the first one. And this is looking again like this is our civil registration. And I hope this is helpful. I hope this is showing how this is really the same information from the same source, but it looks different on every site. When I click that entry to get more detail, I get a screen like this that shows the name, registration year. They also put the 3 months on the quarter, which is helpful. This has a similar thing to the UKBMD site we Googled at the beginning, but I found that the UKBMD site tends to be easier, at least for me, to use. But you can try clicking on this and see how it presents the information of the parishes that are associated with the registration district. Now, it will list the inferred county, which can be helpful, but it can also be incorrect, as we pointed out before, because somebody who was registered in Gainsborough, for example, could have been born in Nottingham. And so that might not, the inferred county for Gainsborough, if it said Lincolnshire, that might not necessarily be correct. And then again, all the sites will offer the volume and the page number, which is very helpful for ordering the certificate. Now notice that Ancestry has a link right here for ordering this certificate. We're going to talk about that in the last section of the webinar when we talk about ordering certificates. So here are the Ancestry search tips. These are basically the same as Family Search, just the exact work's a little bit different on that. For those of you who have used Ancestry, it's fuzzy search by default, and then when you type a name in, you will get an option right below the field that you can click, and you can specify exact to the county, exact to within 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, and so forth.